asked to do today was just kind of give a brief rundown, discussion about where things stand now that we're 1 month away from the 2024 elections. Needless to say, we have had some September surprises. I am scared to death that October is going to say to September, here, hold my beer, with whatever surprise may come out of it. But I think what the way that I look at North Carolina politics in particularly, I wanted to give some context in terms of how I kind of see things playing out and what you might be looking for as well as we get through the next several weeks towards November 5th. I think in general, from the big 30,000 foot stage, and this has been true for several election cycles, North Carolina is what I describe as a stuck and bipolar competitive state. 20 years ago, if you go back to 2004, I don't think anybody would have described North Carolina as a battleground state. We were a very traditional Republican red super majority at the presidential U.S. Senate level. But then at the gubernatorial and kind of state level, we were super Democratic at that time. That collapse of the swing voter in North Carolina has been something I've been very fascinated and interested in, and has resulted in us basically being a stuck and very bipolar, bipartisan, competitive state. Another dynamic, with all due deference to former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, all politics ain't local no more. It's negative and tribalistic. And I'll give a little bit of a sense as to what I mean by that. Within North Carolina, I think we see definitive regional polarization within this battleground state. And I'll talk about the four different regions and the way that I see the data playing out in all of these regions. Another interesting area that I'm really fascinated with, particularly this year, is going to be the generational dynamics at play in this state. And then finally, kind of thinking about where we have been in the past, what might that give us in terms of clues, of hints towards this year's election? So to kind of start off with the analogy of a stuck and bipolar competitive state, in thinking back to 2008, and I would contend 2008 and 2010's elections in this state were critical elections. They fundamentally reshaped this state's politics. If you go back to 2008, go up to 2022, the most recent major election, and then add in all of the votes for the federal races, primarily presidential, U.S. Senate, and then separately add in all of our Council of State contests. So governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, all of the statewide executive offices. What you see at the federal level for both just the basic percentages, but then if you take the two-party vote, you see that we are basically a 51, 52, 48 Republican state at the federal level. But then when you flip to the Council of State contest, we're basically a 51-49 Democratic state. And since 2008, we've kind of been stuck in this dynamic of very close elections for both federal and for statewide offices. So little movements can have big consequences in this particular competitive battleground state. The second point that I made, all politics is basically negative and very tribalistic. And this kind of takes national dynamics, but I think we see this on the ground also here in North Carolina. There's a major survey that's done every election year called the American National Elections Study. And they ask a battery of questions of folks across the country. And one of the key questions that they continuously have asked is on a scale of 0 to 100, meaning 0 is absolute ice cold. 100 is as intensely warm as you can get. They asked the question of partisans, and here I'm including people who lean to one party over the other. How do you rate on that scale of 0 to 100 the opposition? So for Democrats, what are the most negative feelings? And here I'm defining negative feelings as anybody who responds 0 to 20. So within this bandwidth of 0 to 20, how negatively do you see the opposition? For Democrats, both partisan identifiers and the leaners, when asked to kind of rate them and what percentage fell within that 0 to 20 bandwidth, the most negative feelings, about 13% of Democrats had the most negative feelings towards the Republican Party. Then in 1980, they asked Republicans, how do you feel about Democrats? And the most negative feelings towards the Democratic Party were expressed by 14%. So a fairly close dynamic from both partisans looking at the opposition with the most negative feelings. Fast forward 40 years to 2020 and the age of polarization that we now live in among Democrats and their negative feelings towards Republicans, it's at 61%. For Republicans with negative feelings towards the Democratic Party, it's at 68%. And I think this kind of negative feeling, this negative partisanship, is one of the fundamental aspects of our national politics, and I dare say of our state politics as well. I presented this slide to my class, U.S. campaigns and elections, and I said, anybody want to make a prediction of where 2024's most negative feelings are? To a person, they all said it's going to be up into the 70s. So we'll have to wait till realistically early next year to get this data. But the trend line does not portend to anything in terms of significant changes, probably much more escalation of the negative feelings. Another way to think about negative feelings, and particularly tribalism, is asking somebody, how do you identify? Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you an independent? And then based on if you identify as a partisan, how strongly a partisan are you? What's your strength of partisanship? Strong partisans, but maybe not as strong. And then for people who identify as independents, do you lean to one party over the other? Now, notice the percentages at the bottom here. This is for 2016. 9% identified as pure independent, meaning basically 90% of the American electorate identified in some way, shape, or form with one of the two major parties. And then the question was asked, well, how did you vote for president? Did you vote for your party's candidate or did you defect and go to the other side? Among the strong partisans, not surprisingly, they were overwhelmingly for their party's presidential candidate. 97% of strong Democrats voted for Hillary Clinton. 95% of strong Republicans voted for Donald Trump. You move towards the middle, and the not strong partisans, their partisan loyalty drops down to basically three quarters, 76%, 75%. But when you move into the independent leaners, the independent Democrats, the independent leaning Republicans, we see an interesting dynamic at play in that they tend to be more partisan than the people who identify with a political party but are not strongly identifiers. It's only when you get into the middle, the pure independents, where you see a fairly evenly more distributed dynamic at play, and Donald Trump winning 44% to Hillary Clinton's 34, the number of third-party votes goes up dramatically. So this was kind of an early indication. This has been a trend over time This was 2016. Here's 2020's numbers. For strong partisans, again, 96, 97%. For the not strong partisans, we saw something slightly different. Among not strong Democrats, 9 out of 10 of them voted for Joe Biden, but we saw among the not strong Republicans, 20% defecting from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Among the independent leaners, again, as strong as partisans among Democrats, but again, a pretty significant defection rate among the independent Republicans, 15% of them voting against Trump for Joe Biden. Among the independents, again, less than 10% of the electorate, a slight majority of them voting for Joe Biden. I think what I will be watching for this year is yet again that defection rate, and in particular, the defection rate among not strong Republicans and independent Republican leaning voters. That will be, I think, again, kind of a key test to look at. If you look at the exit polls here in North Carolina, the most recent federal election, the U.S. Senate election in 2022, again, based on party identification, Democrats overwhelmingly voted for Beasley. Republicans overwhelmingly voted for Budd. The independents tended to be much more evenly divided. But again, notice the percentages at the bottom. Republicans were 37% of the electorate. That helped to cushion that loss of the independent vote in this state. So, talking a little bit about the competitiveness, the negativism, the tribalistic dynamic, I really have done a lot of research in terms of diving into what makes this battleground state so unique. And one of the key factors is this idea of regional polarization. We talk about the urban, suburban, rural dynamic in our politics, both nationally and here in North Carolina. I use the Office of Management and Budget's definition of defining an urban county, such as Mecklenburg, Charlotte, Wake with Raleigh, Durham with Durham, all the kind of urban counties, and then the counties that interact with that urban county. So Johnston County with Wake County, Union, Cabarrus, Gaston County with Mecklenburg. Define those as surrounding suburban counties, and then everything else is rural. But as I was looking in the data, I thought about, well, there's the central city, there's Charlotte, but then there are the urban suburbs like Cornelius, like Davidson, Huntersville, Pineville. Wake has similar dynamics. All of the urban counties have this central city, but they also have outlying areas within the urban county. So the way that I look at North Carolina in terms of regionalism is pretty much a four-tier approach. You've got the state dynamics for 2016 and 2020, and this is combining votes for U.S. President, U.S. Senate, and North Carolina governor, kind of combining what I call the big three elections. In 2016, we were 52-48 combined state. In 2020, a 51-49 state. But as you break the vote totals down for these big three elections in 2016 and 2020, you see some real differences between the regions. In the central cities, in 2016, and then in 2020, basically anywhere from 2/3 to 70% Democratic dominance. When you move to the urban suburbs, in 2016, they were very narrowly split, 50-50. In 2020, they went slightly more Republican, but they're within the band of what we as political scientists mostly would describe as a competitive election, anywhere from 45 to 55. When you move into the surrounding suburban counties, the Johnston counties, the Union counties, they are the most Republican region of the state in comparison to the rural counties, which are basically a 60-40 split. So in thinking about a competitive state, a battleground state, there's really only one region that is truly competitive. The three other regions are lopsided in terms of their electoral performance and behavior. And then in thinking about the 2022 US Senate election, again, doing it by regions, looking at the two-party vote, the state 52-48, the central cities, again, nearly 70-30. The urban suburbs went even slightly more Republican, but still within that competitive bandwidth. The surrounding suburban and the rural counties were overwhelmingly Republican. And so combining all of this, I also am very interested in the generational dynamics at play in terms of thinking about different cohorts of generations and how they might influence North Carolina politics. In looking at the most recent voter registration data, and this was a week ago today, September 29th's voter registration data, we have basically we're nearing 7.7 million registered voters in this state. And if you break that 7.7 million down into party registration, you'll notice that a plurality are registered unaffiliated. 32% registered Democrats, 30% registered Republicans. But if you break it down by the generations, so the silent generation, anybody over the age of 80, boomers, 60 to 79, Gen X, 44 to 59, millennials, the oldest millennials now, 43, the youngest, 28, and then the newest generation coming in, Gen Z, 18 to 27-year-olds. If you look at their partisan registration, you'll see a distinct trend. Among the older voters, unaffiliateds are the least amongst the group. But when you hit Gen X, basically they are a bridge. They are reflective of the state. Because once you move into voters under the age of 43, for millennials, they're 43% unaffiliated. For Gen Z, this summer they hit 50% unaffiliated. So the statewide rise of the unaffiliated is being driven by folks under the age of 43 this year. And I would note two numbers at the bottom that I'm highlighting here. 26 and 16%. Millennials make up a quarter of the voter pool. Gen Z, 16%. Combine those two, you've got over 40% of the voters of North Carolina under the age of 43. And one of the real questions about this generational dynamic is, well, how do they tend to vote? And in thinking about trying to get at that question, I looked at each precinct in North Carolina, 2,600 precincts across the state, and combined their 2020 presidential, U.S. Senate, North Carolina governors, basically the Republican vote percentage within each of the precincts. And then also found out, well, what percentage of each of these generational cohorts was in each precinct? And so the thinking was, if you combine the silent and boomer generation, as that percentage in the precinct increases, what should happen to the Republican vote share? And my thinking was it should increase. So as the percentage of boomers and silent generation increases in a precinct, so too should the Republican vote share. And indeed, we see that dynamic pretty clearly. As the increase in boomers and silents in a precinct, so too does the Republican vote share. And if we take that boomer slope that I've now indicated with the dashes and look at Gen X, well, how does this generation vote? If they increase in a precinct, what happens to the Republican vote share? Again, it increases, but it is at a much lower slope. They are still more Republican, but the explanation power is very limited with this generation. Now, taking both boomers and now Gen Xers, compare that to millennials and Gen Z. How do they see the Republican vote share being affected as their generations increase in a precinct? It is a clear negative drop. So what this tells me is there at some point is going to be a generational tectonic shift that occurs. Two tectonic plates, millennials and Gen Z's, silent and boomer generation are rubbing up against each other, and there should be some kind of political earthquake that may happen within North Carolina politics if younger generations show up to their political strength. And that's the big question. North Carolina is basically our elections are basically turnout dynamics. In 2020, we saw 3/4 of all the registered voters show up to vote. If you look at the older generations, they were above that state average, but for millennials and Gen Zers, they were well below the state average. In 2022's midterm election for US Senate, again, we see a pattern. Older voters showed up much higher turnout rate numbers. For younger voters, much lower. So my thinking is based on generational dynamics, if millennials and Gen Z punches up to their political weight, we could see that tectonic shift occur in North Carolina. Lastly, thinking about the past voting patterns and election results, what might they say about this year? And again, in thinking about North Carolina, what I'm doing is taking the 2020 Big Three elections, president, US Senate, governor, and the 2022 US Senate election results, and looking at the new congressional map based on these districts and the results that would have occurred if these districts existed at the time. And we see from the results three very strong Democratic districts. The 12th district centered over Charlotte in Mecklenburg County, the 2nd district kind of centered over Raleigh and Wake County, and then the 4th congressional district covering Orange, Durham, and then parts of Wake and Chatham County. All of those election results would point to a Democratic 74, 75, 68 percentage, not competitive in the least. The remaining majority of districts are all Republican in orientation. Most of them are at least 54% or greater. The one competitive district is the 1st congressional district, and that is a competitive but slightly, ever so slightly, lean Democratic district. I think that that one is going to be where the nation's attention really is going to be focused on November 5th. In thinking about the state legislature, the General Assembly, looking at the state Senate districts, the 50 districts in the state Senate, again, using the same metrics, we see amongst the Republican from strong to likely to competitive but lean Republican, 30 seats. On the Democratic side, 20 seats. Now, in North Carolina, for supermajority status, you need 30 seats in the state Senate. If Republicans win all of the districts that they should win, they will have supermajority numbers without having to win any Democratic identifying or leaning districts. In the state house, their numbers for on the Republican side, 71 seats, on the Democratic side, but supermajority in the state house is 72. So they will be one seat or one district shy, meaning they need to win a competitive but likely lean Democratic district in order to gain that supermajority 72. In thinking about this fall's election, when people vote is always a major dynamic at play. And we've seen in North Carolina's elections a real significant shift. Going back to 2004, most people tended to vote on election day, but starting in 2008 and continuing into the presidential years, and then finally in 2018's midterm, we see majorities vote early. North Carolinians love to bank their ballots before election day. And particularly in 2020, they utilized absentee by mail. 18% of all the ballots came through the mail. I don't think we will see that dynamic at play this year because of a lot of dynamics that I can talk about. But the vast majority, 60 to 65%, are probably going to be in the early voting period starting October 17th and running through November 2nd. So I want to talk a little bit about this past week and the impact that Hurricane Helene had on the particularly mountain counties. This is the FEMA designation, disaster designation for the state. You will see 25 counties, mostly in the mountains, along with the eastern band of the Cherokee tribe, also being designated as well. And if you look within, again, the state in terms of its voter registration pool, of those 25 counties out of 100, we have about 1.3 million registered voters. That's 17% of all the voters in North Carolina reside in this designated disaster area. And they tend to be much more Republican. They tend to equate to the unaffiliated, less Democratic. If you look at the three counties with Cherokee tribe land in them, they tend to be even more Republican. The non-federal declared disaster counties, the remaining 75 counties, much more Democratic than necessarily Republican. In thinking about the race and ethnicity of these counties as well. Statewide, 63% of all of North Carolina's voters are white, non-Hispanic, 20% are Black, 4% Hispanic, Latino. Within the federal declared disaster counties, 81% are white. Among the Cherokee tribe, 88%. And among the rest of the state, that number drops down to 60% white, non-Hispanic. So this is basically a white, Republican, older region of the state. If you look at the big three election results in the Helene counties versus the rest of North Carolina, the state being 50-50, it's basically a 60-40 Republican region with the three counties of the Cherokee tribe designation, 73% Republican, the rest of the state, 53-47 Democratic. So again, just to kind of recap, and I'll be glad to take any questions. We're a competitive state. We're going to be a competitive state for the foreseeable future. The negativism, the tribalistic dynamic is very evident in North Carolina. The regionalism and generational dynamics is something I'm really going to be focused on looking at. And yes, we have a lot of data about past elections. If there are subtle shifts this year in terms of who shows up, that could have huge consequences when it comes to the ultimate election results here in North Carolina. And with that,